April.
Yeah, can we go back to the map that was talking about race across Bellingham, race and ethnicity?
The Bellingham one.
Yeah. So I'm interested because sometimes data can show you some things depending on how you unpack it. And anecdotally, because I work in the schools, I mean, I see entire buses in a predominantly white community of children of color coming into a school, so they're living very close to somewhere. And because our numbers are so small, with the way that we're having to take the information from the census data, can we really pick it apart enough to say, do we have discrimination in Bellingham of housing that's more disproportionately toward people of color that are low income? And I'm just concerned just because of what I know, especially within my ward and area, that I just wonder if we can even do that with how low in numbers that we have.
Yeah, it is difficult, and HUD's requirements are quite prescriptive in terms of us using their table and their data. This is we're using the first rollout. We're one of the first communities to do this new AFH process, so they've already started improving it, but we're kind of locked into when we started using their data. We are looking at other sources of data for our consolidated plan to get more into the neighborhood levels as much as we can. But for right now, This is what we have. Do you have anything to add,
For
Kate?
us, just a second, I would love for us to, I know that we have access and we have to be very careful with the data and how we share it, but we do now have access with the public schools and where our children are living, young families with young children are living. And I think if you really picked that out and looked at it, you would see apartment complexes, other areas that are predominantly people of color living in poverty in Bellingham. And so I really want to be careful as we put this information out there, because we need to really, we need to be very clear that it is very limited in the data that we're receiving and then putting out here. So for people to come to conclusions on this, I get that we're doing it and we have to do it because it's a requirement and we have to do it in a specific way, but I don't think that tells a really true picture of Bellingham.
Yeah, they give us a certain criteria for defining a racially and ethnically concentrated area of poverty and it's based on census blocks, I believe. But they also have the opportunity to add local data into our report to the extent we're able to get it. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
I want to say that this report was fascinating. It's very extensive. There's a lot of really great information on here. It's going to be very helpful in regards to us addressing our housing challenges and affordability, et cetera. And I think you did a great job of reaching unrepresented groups. So this was very extensive. I am curious, when people would say that they didn't know where to report discrimination, et cetera, do we send information back to them and tell them where they can do that?
That's certainly part of the plans for our education, is to really highlight those issues and focus on those issues about how to report and what happens when you report.
Okay. And I will say at the end of the survey, we did have information about how to contact the Fair Housing Center of Washington, which is the authority.
Okay. That's great. Committee members, any other? April and then Terry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Still on the committee. So when you go back to this is a great opportunity to educate people on fair housing and where it is and where it's not applicable. So you had a slide that said single-family residences and under 4 apartment complexes.
Oh, yes.
Yellow.
Let me go forward to that.
There it is.
So can you be more specific? Because what I heard, which I don't think is true, is that people that have 4 or less units in one housing complex or a single-family home, they're not required.
If it's owner occupied. So if you have a 4-plex, to my understanding, and you lived in one of those units, you would not have to comply with the Fair Housing Act.
Meaning you could discriminate based on somebody's color?
I believe.
Unless it's publicly advertised.
Right.
So if you put it on Craigslist, you're caught, but
Correct.
if you just circulate it amongst your friends, you can do that?
Word of mouth. You could say to your friends, I don't want to rent to someone because they have children or something.
Yeah.
You could legally do that. You can't say on Craigslist, no children or something.
Okay. And when you say single-family home, so we have several different definitions on that. So are we just saying single-family detached home or anything under 4 units?
I believe that's a single-family
Okay.
home. I don't know if it's detached or not.
Wow.
It is detached.
Detached.
Like just a single-family home, if you wanted to rent out a room in your basement, but you
Okay.
didn't want, a single woman didn't want to rent to a man or a group of people, younger people, and so I think that's why they haven't. Sorry. I think that part of it is because if you in your own home wanted to rent out a room, I don't think the idea is that you can discriminate blatantly, although they can't stop it. But it would be like if you were a single woman with children and you did not want to rent to a man in your home, or young people or whatever, you're allowed in your own home to do what you need to do as far as this goes.
Yeah, it just struck me because I thought I heard that, and I'm glad that you brought that forward because we have huge areas in Bellingham where all you can have is a single-family home. So technically, if they were owner-occupied, you could have huge areas where you could discriminate freely against people. Okay, thank you.
Terry?
Yeah, I thought the report was really well done.
Yeah.
Glad of the outreach with it. Glad to see some of the statistics here, which were, I thought, quite enlightening. I was glad to hear that Bellingham doesn't have segregation, even though some have been stating that single family is racially segregating. And so I'm glad to hear that statement, which we knew was erroneous. But what I found interesting is the breakdowns on some of the different neighborhoods on the amount of rentals in single-family neighborhoods for older neighborhoods as opposed to some of the other neighborhoods, like the Edgemore neighborhood that has 2%, even though they have, it's all single-family, but only 2% rentals in it, or Silver Beach and Samish, both having very high elements of single family, but 80% owner occupied. So which ones have the diversity and mix and are taking those different types of housing? So I thought that was very interesting from you. Thank you.
Thank you. One additional question. I know that it is not under HUD in regards to students or pets, but this is in the report about discrimination, and I'm wondering as a city if there's anything that we can do. I guess we can't be involved, or those kinds of things of discrimination we can't do anything about for students or pets or...
For pets, there's a lot of questions about that, and I think we'd like to bring some professionals in to talk about the difference between service animals and pets and those kinds of things, because there are a lot of nuances there to the law, and so that's another area that we targeted for education.
Committee members, any additional questions? Okay.
As you go further, I don't know how much further you'll go in this report, but especially with the consolidated plan, there was some breakup of certainly the types of neighborhoods and what's available, and I appreciate the goal that said, we should have diverse housing types throughout where people can attain and live near each other even if they're not in the same income level. It would be very interesting, especially as you find other local data sources, to look in our truly multifamily areas and then those single-family areas and determine the ones that are actually part of the discrimination process. So those fit things like ethnicity, age, all of those things. Breaking it down into that truly multifamily, the bigger the high-rise, and then the more single-family. I would like to know if there's any distinction there, because we're using words like erroneous, but I think my understanding is what we're saying is that the data that we have at the census level and how they're putting this together is just how we have to put it together, but it's not as clear as it could be.
Yeah, and we do have data on complaints that have been submitted to HUD, and we did look at those. Unfortunately, most of them are dismissed for one reason or another, and I don't think we have people's addresses who make those complaints to be able to make those kind of correlations. But we certainly want to look deeper into the neighborhood level like you're suggesting, and I made a note of that.
Yeah, I think really understanding that data based on will help us in determining housing choice, and if there is any, if people are living low income mostly in one area, and then if that is also concentrating people of color in those areas would be, I think, interesting, and especially because in here it was talking about, was it Latino or Hispanic single mothers, like more likely to have housing discrimination, some of those things. So I think if we could get the school data, even though you might not be able to show it on a map, but to help inform, we may see that parents of young children, we may see that they're more concentrated in areas, and I think that would be really important for us to look at housing styles and choices for people to live throughout the entire city and not only concentrated in certain areas.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's Hispanic households are disproportionately more likely to be cost burdened.
Cost burdened.
So not necessarily discriminated against, but have a higher likelihood of being cost burdened, and single mothers or single parent households have a much higher rate of poverty.
Poverty, so more likely to live in,
Yeah.
lower income housing unit styles. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Samia, Lisa, and Kate. Any final comments? No? Okay, so this was for information only and a committee.